Get out of that seat, before I have security drag you out of it. The voice cracked across the hush of first class like a whip, sharp enough that 2 flight attendants near the galley actually flinched. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. A newspaper lowered an inch. Somewhere near the back of the cabin, a phone had already come up, its little red light blinking, though no one there yet understood what they were about to record. Daniel Whitfield did not move. He sat by the window in seat 2A, one hand resting flat on the armrest, the other still holding a boarding pass that had not been altered, had not been questioned, had not been anything but exactly correct since the moment he checked in 11 days earlier. "This is my seat," he said, and his voice did not rise even a single note to meet the one shouting at him. Bradley Kessler stood in the aisle in a navy blazer that had clearly never touched a discount rack, a platinum watch glinting under the cabin lights as he lifted his wrist to check a time he wasn't actually reading. "I fly this route 41 times a year," he said. 41 times. Everyone from the CEO of this airline down to the baggage crew knows my name. So I am going to ask you one more time to gather your things." "That's not an answer," Daniel said quietly. "That's a habit you've never had to break." Nobody in the cabin spoke. In exactly 14 minutes. Before this aircraft ever pushed back from the gate, 3 careers would collapse. One company would discover exactly whose patience it had been quietly testing for the last 2 years, and a cabin full of strangers would watch a soft-spoken man become the loudest thing in the sky without ever once raising his voice. But 14 minutes is a long time when you don't yet know who you're speaking to. 90 minutes before that, nobody at Denver International Airport had noticed Daniel Whitfield at all. And that was exactly how he preferred it. He moved through Concourse B at an unhurried pace, a worn brown leather duffel over one shoulder, a slim laptop case in the other hand, wearing a plain gray sweater, dark jeans, and scuffed boots that had walked through more server rooms than boardroom. Nothing about him announced money. Nothing about him announced power. At 44 years old, Daniel Whitfield was the founder and chief executive of Ironclad Systems, a logistic software company most travelers had never heard of and would never think to ask about, even though its code was quietly responsible for keeping nearly a third of domestic flights running on schedule. Crew assignments, fuel routing, gate coordination, maintenance alerts. When an airline's operation ran like a clock, it was very often because somewhere behind the curtain, a system built by his engineers was doing its job without complaint or credit. A woman near the coffee stand glanced at the duffel bag slung low on his shoulder and looked away without a second thought. A man in a pressed suit nearly walked straight into him and didn't apologize. Didn't even seem to register that a person had been there at all. Daniel was used to both. He had spent years in hotel lobbies where the concierge assumed he needed directions to the loading dock. Years in bank branches where a teller asked twice whether the account really belonged to him. He didn't carry anger about it anymore. Anger, he had learned at 23, was a gift you handed to people who were already looking for a reason to dismiss you. What he carried instead was patience, and beneath the patience, a permanent, quiet attention. He noticed everything. He always had. His phone buzzed as he crossed toward gate B14. A message from Priya Anand, his chief operating officer for the last 11 years, the woman who had built spreadsheets with him, on a card table in a rented garage in Aurora, back when neither of them could afford a second monitor. Meridian Air renewal signed. 4 years, full systems integration. "You should be proud of this one, boss." Daniel stopped near a window overlooking the tarmac and read the message twice. It had taken 14 months. 14 months of technical audits, contract red lines, 3 in the morning calls, and careful, exhausting negotiation with airline executives who needed exactly what his company built but never seemed thrilled to need it from him specifically. More than one Meridian vice president had looked across a conference table during that year, with an expression that made it plain they were surprised. The man doing the explaining was also the man whose signature was on the letterhead. He typed back 4 words. "Good work. Dinner's on me." Then he slipped the phone into his pocket and walked toward the gate, where in a few minutes he would board a Meridian Air flight as an ordinary passenger. On an aircraft his own software helped keep in the sky, and not one person on that plane would have the faintest idea. The gate agent scanned his pass without really looking at his face. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Seat 2A. "Thank you," he answered, his voice low and even, and stepped onto the jet bridge, where the noise of the terminal faded behind him into something distant and unimportant. He was looking forward to nothing more complicated than 2 hours of quiet, a window, and a paperback he hadn't opened in 3 weeks. He did not know yet that seat 2A was about to become a courtroom with no judge. He did not know that a stranger's sense of entitlement was about to be measured directly against his own paid ticket, in front of a cabin full of witnesses who would remember every second of it. And he did not know that before this aircraft ever left the ground, Meridian Air would come within one flight of losing the very partnership holding its entire operation together. The first-class cabin looked peaceful when he stepped inside. Soft white light, cream leather seats, the low murmur of passengers settling into their own private corners of comfort. A woman in a burgundy scarf adjusted her seatbelt in 1C. 2 rows back, a man in a gray suit opened a newspaper and pretended not to be watching everyone who boarded. Daniel carried none of that ease with him. He had learned long ago not to move too quickly into rooms where people were already deciding, without realizing it, whether he belonged there. Tit-tad. "Welcome aboard," said Flight Attendant Courtney Vance from the galley, a smile arriving right on schedule, professional, practiced. But her eyes moved faster than her mouth, down to the sweater, the boots, the duffel bag, and lingered there just long enough to make a judgment she likely didn't even realize she was making. "Good afternoon," Daniel said, holding up his boarding pass before she asked. Courtney glanced at it. Her smile stiffened for half a second before recovering. "Seat 2A. Right this way, sir." Daniel filed it away without comment, the way he filed away everything. Some things needed to be observed before they could be understood, and he had never been in a hurry to explain himself to people who hadn't yet earned an explanation. He reached seat 2A, lifted the duffel into the overhead bin, and lowered himself into the window seat with a breath that came out slower than he expected. Outside, a ground crew member in a neon vest signaled toward the cockpit. Across the aisle in 2D, a woman glanced up from a paperback novel. Marjorie Alcott, 68 years old, a retired middle school principal with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the stillness of someone who had spent 4 decades reading a room full of children before they'd learned how to hide anything. She had already caught the flicker in Courtney's smile. She had already seen Daniel notice it and choose, for now, to say nothing. She gave him the faintest nod. He returned it. Then the cabin door opened again, and the air in the room changed. Bradley Kessler entered first class, the way some men enter every room, as though the space owed him recognition before he'd said a single word. 52 years old, broad through the shoulders, silver at the temples, a navy blazer that had never once seen a dry cleaner's discount rack. He raised his wrist to check a platinum watch he clearly wasn't reading. His eyes swept the cabin, found seat 2A, and stopped. The easy confidence in his face cracked for just a moment. Surprise first, then something colder settling in underneath it. He stood in the aisle, gripping the handle of a rolling bag, and for a second, nobody spoke. Courtney brightened automatically. "Mr. Kessler, welcome back." He didn't answer her. He was still looking at Daniel. "That's my seat," he said, pitched low, though not low enough. Courtney blinked, glancing between the 2 men. "Let me check that for you, sir." I don't need you to check it, Bradley said, a thin, humorless laugh escaping him. I sit in 2A every single time I fly this airline. Ask anyone up here. A few heads turned. The man with the newspaper lowered it another inch. Marjorie's eyes sharpened behind her glasses, though she said nothing yet. Daniel turned from the window, unhurried, and looked at Bradley the way a man looks at a mildly interesting weather pattern. "This is my seat," he repeated. "I have the boarding pass to prove it." Courtney stepped closer, tablet held in front of her like a shield. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, it looks like there might be a small mix-up with the seating." "There's no mix-up," Daniel said, holding up his pass. "It says 2A. I checked in 11 days ago. I boarded when they called first class. This is the seat your own system assigned me." Courtney's eyes flicked to the pass and away again. Just as fast, the way people look at evidence they've already decided not to believe. "I understand, sir. It's just that Mr. Kessler is one of our most loyal flyers, and he typically..." "Typically what?" Daniel asked. "Not today." Bradley cut in before she could finish, his tone smoothing into something he clearly believed sounded reasonable. "Look, this doesn't need to become a whole production. I fly this route every week of my life. The crew knows me. The airline knows me. This is my seat, and I would appreciate you not making this difficult for everyone." "Your boarding pass says that," Daniel asked. Bradley's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." More heads turned. Marjorie set her paper back in a blue, no longer pretending to read it. The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper closed entirely. Courtney's composure was beginning to show hairline cracks. "Mr. Whitfield, we do have another seat available. Seat 4C. Same cabin, same service, and I'd be glad to bring you a complimentary drink for the trouble." "Trouble," Daniel repeated, letting the words sit in the air a moment before continuing. "I paid for this exact seat. I sat down when I was told to sit down. Now you are asking me to give it up because a man who boarded after me would prefer the view. Do you understand how that sounds?" Courtney's throat moved as she swallowed. "No one is disputing that you're seated correctly, sir. I'm only asking for a little flexibility." "Flexibility," Daniel said quietly, "is a word people use once they've already decided who is supposed to pay the price for their comfort." Bradley exhaled sharply, glancing toward the galley, as though hoping someone with more authority would materialize and end this quickly. His fingers drummed against the strap of his watch. "Tap, tap, tap." From across the aisle, Marjorie spoke for the first time, her voice calm but carrying the whole length of the cabin. "He asked you a simple question, young lady. What seat is this man assigned?" Courtney froze. It was the exact question she had been hoping no one would ask out loud. "Ma'am, I have this handled." "You clearly don't," Marjorie said, "or you'd have answered it already." Bradley's face reddened. "This is absurd. It's one row. He can move one row back, and everyone can get on with their day." Daniel looked at him, unmoved. "Then you move one row. Your seat is behind mine. Mine has always been 2A." The words landed cleanly, without any heat at all, and somehow that made them land harder. A young couple 2 rows back leaned toward each other, whispering. Near the window, a phone rose slightly, not recording yet, but close. Courtney's composure slipped another degree. "Sir, please, I need you to work with me on this." "I have worked with you," Daniel said. "I showed you my pass. I answered your questions honestly. I am simply asking you to follow your own seating chart. What part of that is difficult?" Nobody answered him. The cabin had gone very still. The kind of stillness that settles when a room understands, all at once, that something honest has just been spoken out loud, and no one yet knows what it will cost. The stillness didn't last. "For heaven's sake," Bradley said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something meaner. "It's one row. You'll survive." Marjorie's fingers tightened around the spine of her book. The word survive hung in the cabin a beat too long, and more than one passenger seemed to feel its weight land somewhere it wasn't meant to. Behind Bradley in row 3, a man named Harold Steuben, silver-haired, reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, finally set his newspaper down entirely. "This has gone on long enough," he muttered, though it wasn't yet clear whose side he was taking. Across from him, a young woman in a denim jacket, Talia Bourne, nudged her boyfriend and lifted her phone, angling it low but steady toward the aisle. "Record this," she whispered. "Just in case." Courtney's eyes caught the movement of the phone, and her professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, panic flashing underneath it before she smoothed it back into place. "Ma'am, there's no need to record anything. We're handling this." "You're not handling it," Marjorie said. "You're stalling it. There's a difference, and everyone in this cabin can see it." A murmur moved through the seats. The man in 5C leaned toward his wife and said, just loud enough to be heard, "She's right. He's been perfectly calm this entire time." Daniel said nothing. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, silence carried more weight than argument ever could. He simply sat, hands folded, watching the room decide who it believed. "I don't want attention," he finally said. "And I'm not looking for a scene. I'm looking for someone in this cabin to explain to me why my paid seat suddenly belongs to somebody else." Bradley's composure was fraying visibly now beneath the blazer and the watch. "You know what I think? I think you're enjoying this. Making a production out of nothing." Harold Product shook his head slowly. "It doesn't look like nothing from here." Talia's phone stayed up, steady, the little recording light blinking. On the screen, though none of them could see it yet, a small number in the corner had already begun to climb. 40 viewers. Then 90. Then 200, as she tagged the clip live to a public account, the caption already written. "First-class meltdown happening right now. Denver to Chicago." Courtney noticed the number climbing over Talia's shoulder, and her stomach dropped. This was no longer a seating dispute contained to 11 rows of a cabin. It was becoming something that would outlive the flight entirely. "Ma'am, please put the phone away," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "No," Talia said simply. The viewer count climbed again. 600. 1,000. Marjorie turned her sharp eyes on Courtney. "You should be more concerned with what's happening in front of you than what's happening on that screen." Bradley, sensing the room slipping further away from him, tried a different tone, smoother, wounded, performing reasonableness for the camera he now clearly knew was there. "I'm not trying to cause a problem. I just don't understand why everyone's acting like I'm the villain. I've flown this airline for 15 years. 15 years doesn't buy you my seat," Daniel said quietly. Harold spoke again, louder this time. "He's right. I don't know either of you, but the ticket doesn't lie." A ripple of agreement moved through the cabin. Small nods, a murmur here and there, the shifting posture of strangers, slowly aligning themselves with the truth in front of them, rather than the volume behind it. The viewer count on Talia's stream crossed 2,000. In another city entirely, a stranger scrolling through their phone paused, watched 10 seconds, and hit share. Owen Marsh, the cabin service manager, was already making his way up the aisle, drawn by the tension the way certain people are always drawn toward rooms they believe only they can fix. Owen moved through first class with the confidence of a man who expected every problem to shrink the moment he arrived. 49 years old, broad-shouldered, hair cut close and precise, a posture that still carried the discipline of the 11 years he'd spent in the Army, before he ever put on an airline blazer. He stopped beside seat 2A, offered the cabin a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and surveyed the scene like a man assessing a minor mechanical fault rather than two human beings. "Afternoon, folks," he said evenly. "What seems to be the trouble?" Courtney practically sagged with relief. "Mr. Kessler normally sits in 2A. Mr. Whitfield has the seat today, but he's declined the alternative we offered." Owen didn't ask why the alternative had been offered in the first place. He didn't ask whose name matched whose ticket. His mind had already sorted the situation into a shape he recognized. A valued flyer, a minor inconvenience, a stubborn passenger standing in the way of a smooth departure. He crouched slightly beside Daniel. His voice dipped into practiced calm. "Sir, I appreciate your patience. We're going to get this resolved quickly." "Are you?" Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Owen's smile flickered. "We certainly are." "Then let's start with something simple," Daniel said. "Whose seat is this?" Courtney shifted her weight, eyes dropping to her tablet. Owen hesitated, just long enough for everyone nearby to notice the hesitation. "It's assigned to you, sir," he finally admitted. "Then why?" Daniel asked, his voice still level, still unhurried. "Am I the one being asked to move?" Owen exhaled slowly through his nose. "Because we're trying to keep the customer experience smooth for everyone involved." "There it is," Daniel said quietly. "There's what?" Owen frowned. "The words," Daniel said, glancing around the cabin. "Smooth experience, flexibility, cooperation. Every one of them sounds pleasant, and somehow every single one of them requires me to give something up." Silence again. Even Bradley for once said nothing. "If Mr. Kessler were the one seated in 4C, Daniel continued, nobody in this cabin would call that a problem worth solving. But because I'm the one sitting in 2A, suddenly, the entire aircraft needs my cooperation." Bradley's face reddened. "Oh, come on. You want to make this about race now?" Daniel turned his head toward him, calm and unblinking. "No," he said. "You did." "I never said anything about race." "No," Daniel agreed. "You didn't have to." The words moved through the cabin harder than any raised voice could have. Marjorie closed her book with a soft, final snap, the sound somehow louder than it should have been. Near the galley curtain, a younger flight attendant, Priya Delacroix, 24 years old, and barely 4 months into the job, stood frozen with a tray of water glasses in her hands, watching the exchange with an expression that had nothing professional left in it at all. She had said nothing. She had done nothing. But something in her face had already changed, and it would stay changed for the rest of the flight. Owen straightened, jaw tightening. "Sir, nobody here is discriminating against you." "Then answer my question honestly," Daniel said. "If I looked like him, would we still be having this conversation?" The cabin went utterly still, real stillness this time, the kind with weight to it. Owen opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because somewhere beneath the training and the uniform and the practiced calm, he knew he could not answer that question honestly, and everyone watching knew it too. Bradley tried to laugh it off. "Unbelievable. You people always find a way to make everything about." "Stop talking," Marjorie said, cutting him off without raising her voice at all. "You've said quite enough." Bradley's mouth snapped shut. For the first time since he'd boarded, he looked less like a man in control of the room, and more like a man realizing, too late exactly, how much of it he had already lost. Owen straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim some authority he could feel slipping through his fingers. "Mr. Whitfield, at this point, your refusal to cooperate is becoming a disruption to the flight." Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly. There it was. The transformation complete. A seated passenger holding a valid ticket had somehow become a disruption, simply for declining to accept mistreatment politely enough. "Say that again," Daniel said quietly. "Sir, we need this resolved before departure." "You said my refusal to cooperate is creating a disruption," Daniel said. "I would like you to tell this entire cabin exactly what it is you believe I am refusing to do." Owen's mouth opened and closed. No answer came. Behind him, Priya's hands had begun to tremble slightly around the tray she was still holding, though she said nothing. Not yet. For a moment the cabin lights blurred at the edges of Daniel's vision, and underneath the tension, a memory rose up on its own, uninvited, the way old wounds do when they recognize their own shape reappearing in front of them. He was 23 again, standing in a small brick bank branch on Colfax Avenue, holding a folder of paperwork for the very first business loan he had ever tried to secure. He'd been up 2 nights straight preparing the numbers. He wore his only good shirt, sleeves a little too short at the wrist, because he hadn't yet learned what a well-fitted suit was supposed to cost or where to find one. The loan officer, a heavy-set man named Gerald Whitmore, had looked at the paperwork, then at Daniel, then back at the paperwork, with an expression that made clear he had already decided something before a single number had been discussed. "This account," Whitmore had said slowly. "This is really yours? Not a family member's? Not someone you're fronting for?" "It's mine," Daniel had said. "The business is mine. Everything in that folder is mine." Whitmore hadn't touched the paperwork. "We'll need additional documentation. Sometimes people bring in numbers that don't quite match what they're representing." "There's nothing to match," Daniel had said, voice steady, even as something inside him tightened. "The numbers are exactly what they are." "I'm sure they are," Whitmore had said, in a tone that made it clear he wasn't sure of anything at all. "Come back with a lawyer. It'll go faster." Daniel had come back 3 weeks later with a lawyer beside him, the exact same paperwork in the exact same folder. And this time, without a single additional question, the loan was approved in 9 minutes. Nothing about the numbers had changed. Only the presence of someone standing beside him whom Whitmore had decided, on sight, to trust. Daniel had never forgotten those 9 minutes. How quickly a truth he'd been telling all along suddenly became believable once someone else's face was in the room to vouch for it. It had planted something small and permanent in him. Not bitterness, though there had been plenty of room for it. Resolve. A quiet decision that someday the numbers alone would have to be enough. That someday he would build something that didn't need a lawyer standing beside him for people to believe what was already true. He had built exactly that. And 21 years later, that same practiced doubt was standing over him again, in a different uniform, using different words, but asking underneath all of it the exact same question Gerald Whitmore had asked him in a bank 2 decades ago. "Are you sure this is really yours?" Daniel blinked, and the cabin came back into focus, sharp and present around him. Owen was still standing over him, waiting for an answer to a question that had no honest answer. "Sir," Owen tried again, voice thinner now, "if we could step to the galley and discuss this privately." "No," Daniel said. The words stopped him cold. "This started in public," Daniel continued. "You questioned my right to sit here in public. You called my refusal a disruption in public. You offered my seat to another passenger in public. Now that the truth has become inconvenient, you want privacy." Marjorie nodded at once, slow and deliberate, as though grading an answer and finding it correct. Harold, still watching from row 3, muttered, "He's got a point." Owen's eyes flicked toward Talia's phone, still recording, the viewer count now climbing past 4,000. Comments scrolling faster than anyone in the cabin could read them. "Name the airline. This is insane." Someone tagged a local news account. Bradley, sensing the tide fully turning against him, made one last attempt to reclaim ground. "You know, for someone so calm, you sure seem to be enjoying all this attention." Daniel turned to look at him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something flickered behind his composure. Not anger, something colder and more tired. "I don't want attention," he said. "I want you to hear yourself. Every excuse you've offered in the last 10 minutes has required someone else to disappear so that you could be comfortable." Bradley said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. Priya, still frozen near the galley curtain, finally set the tray of water glasses down on the counter, her hands no longer steady enough to hold it. She didn't speak. Not yet. But she had stopped pretending this was a normal flight, and something in her expression told Marjorie, watching from across the aisle, that this young woman was quietly choosing a side, even if she didn't yet have the courage to say it out loud. Owen straightened his shoulders one more time, grasping for whatever authority had been slipping through his fingers since the moment he'd walked into the cabin. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached down and opened the laptop case resting by his feet. Owen flinched at the movement, and several phones in the cabin lifted slightly higher, capturing it. Daniel's hand moved with deliberate slowness, the opposite of a threat, and pulled out a thin black folder. No logo, no embossed lettering, just plain leather worn soft at the corners from years of use. He set it on his tray table, but did not open it right away. "I want everyone in this cabin to understand something," he said, his voice carrying without ever rising. "I have not raised my voice. I have not blocked the aisle. I have not ignored a single safety instruction. I am sitting in the seat I was assigned, and I am being treated like the problem." He opened the folder and slid out a single printed page, unremarkable at first glance, until Courtney leaned in close enough to read the header, and her face lost its color one shade at a time. Meridian Air, Master Systems, Services Agreement. Vendor Ironclad Systems. Contract term current through next fiscal year. Renewal executed this morning. "Had Ironclad," she said quietly, almost to herself. Owen's eyes dropped to the page, and something in his posture changed instantly, the confidence draining out of his shoulders like water through a cracked pipe. He knew that name. Every manager at this airline knew that name, even if they'd never once connected it to a face. Ironclad Systems wasn't a vendor in the way people usually meant the word. It was the framework underneath half the airline's daily operations. The reason gate changes appeared without chaos. The reason maintenance delays rarely became headlines. The reason the whole enormous machine of the airline moved as smoothly as it usually did. "I was hoping to fly home today as an ordinary passenger," Daniel said quietly, closing the folder. "But since you've decided I don't belong in this seat, I think it's time you learned exactly who you were asking to move." Bradley stared at the page, confused, grasping for one last foothold. "So you sell them some software. That doesn't make this seat yours." Daniel turned to him, calm and unhurried. "No, Mr. Kessler. My boarding pass makes this seat mine. It always did." The sentence landed harder than the folder had. It brought the entire confrontation back to where it should have started. Not with a company name, not with money, but with a simple paid ticket that had been ignored from the very first minute. Owen cleared his throat, voice unsteady now. "Mr. Whitfield, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No," Daniel said, "there hasn't." His phone buzzed on the tray table. The screen lit up with a name Courtney recognized instantly, because it appeared at the top of every internal memo the airline had circulated in the last 3 years. Regina Castellanos, Meridian Air's chief executive officer. Daniel let it ring once, twice, a third time, the sound stretching through the cabin like a held breath. Then he picked it up, pressed the screen, and set the phone down between them, speaker on, his voice steady. "Regina." "Daniel," came the reply, sharp with concern even through the small speaker. "What's going on?" "I'm getting alerts that Flight 219 is delayed at the gate, and someone already tagged our name online with 9,000 views climbing. I'm sitting in seat 2A, Daniel said, the seat I paid for on the flight I booked. Your crew has spent the last 15 minutes trying to convince me to give it up for another passenger because I didn't look like someone who belonged there." There was a pause on the line, cold and total. "Put me on speaker for the crew," Regina said. Daniel glanced up. Owen and Courtney exchanged a look that had nothing left of authority in it. "Mr. Marsh," Regina said, her voice now filling the cabin, clear and controlled. "Is there any safety reason Mr. Whitfield cannot remain in his assigned seat?" Owen's throat worked. "No, ma'am. Is there any regulation requiring him to move?" "No, ma'am. Is Mr. Kessler assigned to that seat?" Owen's eyes flicked toward Bradley, who had gone very still. "No, ma'am." A long silence stretched through the cabin, broken only by the faint click of phone cameras, still recording. Then perhaps you can explain to me, Regina said, why the chief executive of the company that keeps this airline's operations running has spent the last quarter of an hour being pressured to abandon a seat he legally holds a ticket for. And while you're at it, you can explain why this is not the first complaint of this exact kind to reach my desk this year. The word landed in the cabin like something physical. Chief executive. Courtney's hand rose to her mouth. Harold muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer. Marjorie closed her eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in something closer to grief. Because the reveal didn't make Daniel more deserving of respect. He had already been deserving of it. That was the wound underneath everything that had just happened. Bradley stared at Daniel as though seeing him for the very first time. You're Daniel Whitfield. I was Daniel Whitfield, he said quietly. Before you decided I wasn't worth checking. The stream Talia was still holding had crossed 11,000 viewers, then 14. Comments scrolled too fast to read. A handful of strangers were already tagging news accounts, already asking for names. Mr. March, Regina's voice continued through the phone, steady and merciless in its calm. You will step away from that seat immediately. Owen stepped back as though the air itself had pushed him. Miss Vance, Regina went on. I need you to understand something clearly, because I want no confusion about what happens next. You looked at a paying passenger and decided within seconds that he did not belong in the seat he was legally assigned. You spent 15 minutes trying to talk him out of a truth that was sitting right in front of you the entire time, and this is the third time in 18 months that a complaint with this exact shape has reached me. That is not one bad afternoon. That is a pattern, and patterns end today. Ma'am, Courtney's voice cracked. You are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight, effective immediately, Regina said. Another crew member will take over first-class service. This is not a discussion. Courtney's eyes filled, though she said nothing more. Mr. Marsh, Regina continued, the same applies to you, and it goes further. Human Resources will be reviewing every seating complaint filed against you going back 3 years, starting tonight. Owen opened his mouth, closed it again, and simply nodded, the fight completely gone out of him. And Mr. Kessler, Regina said, her tone shifting only slightly. Your loyalty status with this airline, along with your corporate travel account, is revoked effective today. I don't imagine you'll need to fly with us again after this. Bradley's face went through several colors at once, landing finally on something pale and hollow. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice cracking for the first time. I've spent $40,000 a year with this airline. That buys you a seat, Regina said flatly. It has never once bought you the right to take someone else's. He looked around the cabin for support and found none. Harold looked away. The young couple 2 rows back didn't lift their eyes from their laps. Even Marjorie, who had defended a stranger without hesitation minutes earlier, only looked at him now with something closer to pity than anger. Bradley opened his mouth once more, some fragment of a defense rising in his throat, and then, for the first time in the entire confrontation, said nothing at all. There was nothing left to say that would not make it worse, and some small, buried part of him seemed to understand that for the first time. Through all of it, Daniel sat exactly as he had from the beginning, still composed, his hands folded on the tray table, his eyes on the window rather than on the 3 people whose choices had just ended around him. He had not asked for anyone to be fired. He had not demanded it. He had simply told the truth calmly, and let the truth do what truth eventually does when enough people are finally forced to look directly at it. Near the galley curtain, Priya Delacroix stood frozen, watching the moment settle over the cabin, her eyes glassy, her hands finally still. She had not spoken a single word through any of it, but something in her had shifted permanently, and everyone close enough to see her face understood that this quiet, nervous young woman would never again stand silently through a moment like this one. "Thank you, Regina," Daniel said quietly, and ended the call. The cabin exhaled all at once, a long, uneven breath, passing through 11 rows of strangers who had just watched something they would be describing to other people for years. The plane settled into a different kind of quiet after that, not tense, something closer to reverence. Priya was the one who finally stepped forward, a fresh glass of water balanced carefully in her hand, her voice small but steady as she reached Daniel's seat. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I'm so sorry for what happened. I should have said something sooner. I wanted to." Daniel looked up at her, and something in his expression softened for the first time since he'd boarded. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "You're not the one who needs to learn anything today." Her eyes glistened, but she managed a small, grateful smile before setting the glass down and stepping back toward the galley, lighter somehow than she had been 10 minutes earlier. Across the aisle, Marjorie leaned toward him. "You handled that with more patience than any of them deserved," she said. "Patience isn't the same as forgetting," Daniel replied. Marjorie smiled, small and knowing. "No," she said, "it never is." The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, engines rising into their familiar low growl, runway lights sliding past the window in long silver streaks as rain began to fall against the glass. Daniel watched it for a while, saying nothing, feeling none of the triumph he might have expected to feel. What sat in his chest instead was something quieter and heavier, the particular exhaustion that comes from winning a fight that never should have needed fighting in the first place. His phones buzzed once more, and he glanced down to see a message from Priya Anand. "Someone just sent me a clip with 90,000 views. Is that you?" He allowed himself the faintest smile. "It's me. I'm fine. Tell the team I'll explain everything tomorrow." Then he put the phone away, leaned his head back against the seat, and let the plane carry him upward into the gray Colorado sky. 5 months later, the story had a second chapter that never made it onto anyone's phone screen. Bradley Kessler's employer, a regional insurance firm, where he had spent 11 years building his reputation as their most reliable road warrior, quietly declined to renew his contract after the video. Reached 2 million views, and 3 separate business partners forwarded it to the board, with the same one-line question attached. "Is this who represents us?" He spent the better part of a year sending emails that went unanswered, sitting across from interviewers who had clearly already watched the clip before he walked into the room, learning in the slowest, most humbling way possible that a reputation built entirely on being deferred to collapses very fast, once the deference stops. He wrote Daniel a letter eventually, unprompted, admitting in careful, halting sentences that he had spent 15 years. Assuming his comfort was simply how the world was supposed to work, and that watching himself on that recording, over and over, was the first time in his adult life he had ever been forced to see himself the way a stranger would. Daniel read it once, did not reply, and did not need to. Some lessons only mean something when they cost exactly what they should. Courtney Vance left the airline within the month, though not by choice. Owen Marsh's review turned up 4 prior complaints that had been quietly closed without action, and both his and Courtney's departures became the reason Meridian rebuilt its entire seating display protocol from the ground up, with a new rule etched into training manuals company-wide. No crew member may ask a correctly seated passenger to relocate for another passenger's preference, full stop. A small envelope arrived at Daniel's office a few weeks after the flight, addressed in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside was a single note from Marjorie Alcott. No return address, no request. Just a few lines thanking him for showing her, at 68 years old, that dignity could still hold its ground without ever raising its voice. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and kept it in the drawer where he kept the things that mattered most. Months later, Daniel boarded another Meridian flight, unannounced and unnoticed, wearing the same plain sweater and the same worn boots he always traveled in. At the front of the cabin stood Priya Delacroix, no longer nervous, no longer silent, greeting each passenger by name from memory. When she reached him, her face broke into a warm, easy smile that had nothing to do with his title, and everything to do with simply remembering who he was. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Seat 2A is exactly where it should be." He smiled back, settled into the seat by the window, and watched the clouds catch the last gold light of the afternoon. Respect he had come to understand long before that day, and would carry with him long after it, was never supposed to depend on who a person turned out to be. It was only ever supposed to depend on the simple fact that they were a person at all. If this story moved you, we would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about dignity, quiet strength, and standing your ground with grace, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that respect should never depend on appearances. Every like, every subscribe, and every share helps us keep telling stories like this one. And if you believe respect should never depend on appearances, leave 3 words in the comments below.